Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, near La Crosse, Wisconsin. He had an older brother, Henry, born in 1901. He was the child of George Gein and Augusta Gein. George worked at times as a carpenter, tanner, and insurance salesman, but struggled to keep down these jobs due to his alcoholism. Augusta hated him because of this, but remained married to him out of her Lutheran beliefs. George owned a local grocery store, but sometime after Ed was born, he sold the business and the family moved to a secluded farm in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. They would spend the rest of their lives here. The family had minimal contact with others. Ed and Henry would only leave the farm to attend school. Ed did well in school and wasn't known for misbehaving, but he was very shy and had strange habits. One thing he was known for was his frequent and seemingly random laughter that most wrote off as him just laughing at his own jokes. Whenever Ed or Henry attempted to make friends at school, their mother would punish them. She wanted to be the only influence in her children's lives. Augusta would always explain to her boys the evil of the world and how all women were whores. I wondered if this applied to her too. Every night, she would read to them passages from the Bible, particularly ones involving violence and death. Augusta was a generally eccentric, violent, and domineering mother. But despite all of her abuse, Ed viewed her as a godly figure. His obsession with her continued into his adulthood. His brother, Henry, viewed her in the opposite way and recognized her for the domineering person that she was. Ed was often offended by how negatively Henry viewed their mother, and Henry was becoming concerned with how attached Ed was to their mother. Not much is known about what Ed did in his early adulthood. The brothers did chores on the farm, while their father, George, provided for the family. However, this ended on April 1st, 1940, when George's alcoholism finally caught up to him, and he died of heart failure at the age of 66. Following his death, the brothers were forced to start working odd jobs around the town of Plainfield. During this time, Ed often babysat for his neighbors, a job which he enjoyed doing, as he seemed to relate more to children than he did to adults. Meanwhile, Henry had begun dating a woman and planned to marry her and move out of the farm, but these plans did not come to fruition. On May 16, 1944, the two brothers were burning off vegetation in the yard when the fire got out of control. Ed and Henry tried desperately to put out the fire, but eventually, the fire department had to come in and help. Henry got separated from Ed during the fire, and a search for him began once the fire was put out. Henry's dead body was found in the woods, face down and with bruises on his head. The coroner stated that Henry had died of asphyxiation. After the deaths of George and Henry, there were only two left in the family, Ed and his mother Augusta. Not long after Henry's death, Augusta suffered a stroke which paralyzed her. For the next year and a half, Ed was her full-time caretaker. Her condition did not improve. In late 1945, Augusta suffered another stroke, and on December 29, 1945, Augusta Gein passed away. Ed was devastated. He was now completely alone in the world. He continued working jobs around Plainfield and attempted to befriend his co-workers so he wouldn't be so lonely, but since his mother forbade him from making friends in his childhood, his social skills were poor and many of the townsfolk viewed him as an awkward but otherwise friendly man. During this time, Ed became obsessed with pulp magazines and was particularly interested in horror stories from Nazi Germany. Some people believe that these stories may have inspired Ed's later crimes. Ed did not take care of the farm. The property became overgrown with weeds, The house grew messy and fell into disrepair, and Ed rarely showered or shaved himself. As the house grew more disheveled, one room remained in pristine condition: his mother's room. Ed had difficulty moving past his mother's death, and her room was the only thing left of her. It was this desire to bring his mother back that drove him to commit his ghastly crimes. Around 1947, Ed began robbing graves. Over the next 5 years, he reportedly made at least 40 trips to the local graveyards and exhumed recently buried corpses. Ed stated that he made all these trips while in a daze-like state. On most of these occasions, he would snap out of the daze and leave the graveyard empty-handed, but on at least 9 occasions, he would find a corpse that looked similar to his mother and took it to his home. Ed was careful to not leave a trace, and nobody realized the graves had even been disturbed until years later. Ed claims his trips to the graveyard ended in 1952, and his life was somewhat normal for a time. However, this ended in late 1954, when his crimes escalated. Mary Hogan was a 55-year-old woman who owned a tavern in Pine Grove, a town just north of Plainfield. Ed often visited her tavern and became somewhat fascinated with her. She was a large woman with dark hair and a German accent, just like Ed's mother. It was through this fascination that Hogan became Ed's first known victim. On December 8, 1954, Ed paid a visit to Hogan's tavern. He stayed there late into the night until everyone left and the bar was closing. He then walked over to Hogan, pulled out a gun, and shot her. He then took her body to his home, either with a sled or a pickup truck. The next day, a trail of blood was found leading out from the tavern and into the parking lot. A cartridge for a .32 caliber pistol was found nearby. Unfortunately, there was no other evidence left at the crime scene. Her disappearance baffled the surrounding towns, but there was one prevailing theory. There were rumors that she had connections to the mafia, and she was killed as a result of some dispute with them. Following her death, Ed would sometimes joke about her disappearance whenever her name was mentioned. One of Ed's co-workers once remarked, "Eddie, if you had spent more time courting Mary, she'd be cooking for you instead of missing." To which Ed replied, "She's not missing, she's at the farm right now." The townspeople did not suspect Ed of murdering Mary Hogan, and they continued to view him as a harmless person. There was one odd thing he was known for, which was his collection of shrunken heads. The townspeople heard about his collection from a teenager who was invited into Ed's decrepit home and saw the heads for himself. Ed claimed these were gifts from a cousin who served in the Philippines during World War II. Ed didn't commit any known crimes for nearly 3 years, but when he struck again, it would lead to his downfall. Bernice Warden was the owner of Warden's hardware store in Plainfield. Ed was a frequent customer of her store, and on the night of November 15, 1957, he paid a visit to the store, presumably to plan his next murder. He claimed he would return the next morning to purchase antifreeze. The next morning, Bernice Warden disappeared. Bernice Warden's son, Frank Warden, was a deputy sheriff and arrived at the store at around 5 p.m. the same day. There were blood stains on the floor, and the cash register had been emptied. Frank told the investigators that one of the last customers he saw in the store was Ed Gein. With this information, Ed became the prime suspect. He was arrested at a grocery store later that evening, and his property was searched by authorities. One of the sheriffs decided to check the shed. In the shed, they found Bernice Worden's body hung upside down, decapitated, and mutilated. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle. It was a horrific sight, but things would only get weirder once the sheriffs looked through Ed's house. In the house, the police discovered masks made from human faces, chairs with human skin covering the seats, leggings made from human skin, a corset made from human skin, a garbage can and lampshade made from human skin, a belt made out of nipples, several vulvas, several skulls including Mary Hogan's, and Bernice Worden's head and heart. The police also discovered his rumored collection of shrunken heads, which they determined were actually faces he peeled from corpses. The crime scene was so horrific that it immediately gained national attention, and people from the surrounding areas came to gawk at Ed's house. The investigators soon began questioning Ed on his crimes, but he refused to give away any information for several days. One of the investigators was so frustrated that they assaulted Ed by banging his head into the wall. Ed eventually confessed, though it was deemed inadmissible due to the previous assault. He claimed his goal was to create what he called a woman suit so that he could become his mother. It's the reason why his victims were all people that resembled Augusta. Ed admitted to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, and said that all the other keepsakes were made from corpses he dug up from the graveyards. On November 21st, Ed was charged with 1 count of first-degree murder for that of Bernice Worden. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity and underwent a mental health screening in early 1958. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, thus leaving him unfit to stand trial. He was then transferred to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, located over an hour away from Plainfield. Many Plainfield residents felt that justice had not been served, and they filed lawsuits against Gein, demanding thousands of dollars in reparations. To pay off these demands, Ed's property and belongings were ordered to be auctioned off. The auction was scheduled for March 30th, 1958. Items like his nipple belt or shrunken heads were not auctioned off, as they had already been disposed of by the police. Some of the townspeople protested the auction as they feared that it would turn Ed's property into something of an exhibit. 10 days before the auction, on March 20th, the house burned down. It's unknown what caused the fire. Some think it was an arson attack, while others believe it was caused by cleaning crews who were burning off garbage on the site. When Ed was told about the fire, he simply said, "Just as well." The auction continued as planned, and whatever remained after the fire was sold. Luckily, it was still enough to pay off the lawsuits leveled against Ed. Meanwhile, Ed seemed to be enjoying his time in the Central State Hospital. He was obedient and got along with the other patients. Every so often, he would undergo screening to see if he had recovered from his schizophrenia and was fit to stand trial. It wasn't until 1968, after 10 years had passed, that Ed would finally stand trial. By this point, he was 62 years old and had gained some weight while in the mental hospital. Preliminary hearings took place on January 22nd, and the trial officially commenced on November 7th. Once again, Ed pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. During the trial, he claimed that on his trip to Worden's hardware store, he was in a daze. He accidentally shot Bernice Worden and did not remember taking her body home and cutting her up. Naturally, the judge did not believe his story. After a 1-week trial, Ed was found guilty of first-degree murder. However, a second trial took place to determine if he was sane or not, and after determining that he wasn't, the decision was changed. Ed Gein was found not guilty of murder by reason of insanity. He subsequently returned to Central State Hospital. Although he enjoyed his time at the hospital, he wanted to be let free. He attended a few sanity hearings in the 1970s, but was denied his freedom each time. In 1978, Ed was transferred to the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. He spent his last 6 years here, suffering from lung cancer. On July 26, 1984, Edward Gein died of respiratory failure, a month shy of his 78th birthday. He was buried between his mother, Augusta, and his brother, Henry. Over the years, sightseers vandalized and chipped away at his gravestone, and eventually someone stole the entire thing. It was recovered in 2001, but was replaced with an unmarked grave. In total, Ed Gein is confirmed to have killed only 2 people. By most definitions, this means he is technically not a serial killer, despite often being labeled as one. It's possible that Ed killed people other than Hogan and Warden, though. He's been a suspect in the case of Evelyn Hartley, a 14-year-old babysitter from La Crosse who disappeared in 1953. There's also speculation that Ed's brother, Henry, was his first victim. As stated before, the two did not see eye to eye when it came to their mother. This could serve as a motive for Ed to kill Henry. The police were suspicious about the bruises on Henry's head, but they could have been caused by a number of things. Without any solid evidence, it remains unknown whether or not Ed killed Henry. It's very hard to find actual photos of the artifacts Ed Gein created. Many of the images are merely things that were inspired by him or recreations of things he made. In fact, I think it's safe to say none of Ed's creations exist anymore. They were all either destroyed after the fire or thrown away after the investigation. Ed's crimes have had a huge impact on popular culture. He is the inspiration for the character Norman Bates from Psycho, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, and Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. Speaking of Patrick Bateman...
Do you know what Ed Gein said about women?
Ed Gein, maitre d' a canal bar?
No. Serial killer, Wisconsin in the 50s.
And what did Ed say?
He said, when I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think 2 things. One part of me wants to take her out and talk to her, be real nice and sweet and treat her right.
And what'd the other part of him think?
What her head would look like on a stick.
This is actually not a quote from Ed Gein, but rather from Ed Kemper.